Welcome, Bonnie Bright, to the summit. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Bonnie.
Well, thanks for having me, Jocelyn. I'm really happy to be here.
Wonderful to have you. I will go ahead and read your bio first so that everybody can get to know you a little bit. Bonnie Bright, PhD, is the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, a free online community for everyone interested in Jungian and depth psychologies, and of depthlist.com, a free-to-search database of Jungian and depth psychology-oriented practitioners. She is also the creator and executive director of Depth Insights, a semi-annual scholarly journal, and regularly produces audio and video interviews on depth psychology topics. She holds MA degrees in psychology from Sonoma State University and in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California, where she also earned her PhD. Bonnie has completed 2-year certifications in archetypal pattern analysis via the Assisi Institute, in technologies of the sacred with West African elder Malidoma Somé, and has been extensively involved in holotropic breath work and the Enneagram. Wonderful. And also I want to introduce just quickly Depth Psychology Alliance. Everybody can access that either through the Summit website or by going to www.depthpsychologyalliance.com. No spaces or hyphens, it's all one word. And so this is a hub for all things depth psychology with over 4,500 members. Depth Psychology Alliance is a free online community for everyone interested in depth and Jungian psychologies. Come dialogue, explore, experience, and pollinate with like-minded others from all over the world.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Maybe after this we'll have 45,000 members who are all interested in depth and Jungian psychologies.
And so today we will be talking about such an interesting topic, culture collapse disorder. And so the quick description of this from Bonnie is, over time, humans belonging to Western cultures have undergone a profound restructuring of the psyche, resulting in a traumatic sense of separation. Culture collapse disorder relates to a disturbing phenomenon in the natural world, colony collapse disorder, where beehives collapse because the bees become separated from the hive and can no longer navigate home. Culture collapse disorder is a term I use to describe how the wounded relationship between culture and nature has affected our modern mindset, contributing to disorientation, despair, and the collective loss of connection to an archetypal sense of home. And so, Bonnie, to get started, you have spent much of your time as a researcher, writer, and scholar over the past few years dedicated to understanding the psyche-nature connection. How did you come to have a sense of calling about the way humans relate to the earth?
Well, I realize that not everybody feels such a profound sense of calling, even though we're probably all of us becoming quite concerned about some of the things that are going on the planet right now, and just the way that humans are interacting with nature and or not interacting with nature, as the case may be. In my case, it was about 10 years ago. I was attending a workshop in which we were doing a lot of really deep kind of somatic work and breath work and various kinds of things that would really help one to get in touch with oneself, one's body, the earth, all that kind of thing. And I remember the instructor standing at the front of the class and saying, he was holding a Time magazine and maybe a New York Times, a couple of publications that said, they had covers that were talking about some devastating crises that were going on the planet and extinction and those kinds of things that we're all so familiar with in the media today. And he said, there's going to be a real need for some people who understand a few things. And I remember that's exactly how he phrased it, who understand a few things, whatever that might be, right, about what's going on, and who can really help people to navigate through the coming crisis and through these difficult times that are really going to be more and more intensively upon us over the course of the next few years and decades. And it was almost, it was like one of those kind of classical moments, like, the lightning bolt out of the blue. I literally almost fell off my chair. And I had no background in psychology to speak of at that time. And I had no idea what that might mean to me, but I felt this tremendous sense of calling. It was kind of one of those who me moments where, I didn't know what that meant. But fast forward 10 years later, somehow one thing led to another in this very synchronistic kind of way. And I've managed to do a lot of graduate work get a lot of education in depth psychology, which is such a profound system for understanding the unconscious and those forces that drive us unconsciously. So, you know, I think that there is something in each of us that is, it's that seed of our calling. And that manifests at different times for each different person. But for me, definitely it was related to this idea of being a resource and being able to not only understand what's happening to us, but also to understand how we might deal with it individually and collectively.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, one of those lightning bolt moments. I like that analogy. So can you tell us a little more about culture collapse disorder and where did the idea come from?
Well, you know, I think it's probably not it's not a leap to understand that this is based on the idea of colony collapse disorder, which most people have heard about by now. And of course, that's the mass vanishing of honeybees. This really came to collective attention around about late 2006 when some honeybee keepers were going to check their hives and remove the tops of the hives in these kind of traditional box hives that usually are commercially kept, and discovered that the hives were completely empty except the queen and just a handful of her attendants. There was also lots of untouched honey, and the brood, the unhatched bees were still there, but the worker bees, all of the other bees were completely gone. And more interesting than that, and what really mystified scientists at the time, was typically when a bee dies, it will die somewhere within the vicinity of the hive. Often it's, you know, just worn out its wings, or it's gotten sick, or, you know, there's all kinds of parasites and various things that affect honeybee hives, and definitely they have been on the decline for a while. But in this case, the bees were nowhere to be found. Even the bodies of the bees were not just outside the hive where they normally would have been. And so they were not only dying, which we know now, of course, to be the case, but they were dying, presumably vanished, kind of out in the fields and dispersed quite widely, so that we just didn't see the bulk of the bees that were gone. And so it was a tremendous mystery. The scientists are still wondering and trying to understand what it is that's happening around colony collapse disorder. Within the first year, something like a quarter of beekeepers in the United States had reported losses of about 30% of their bees, which is really extreme when you start looking at it. It amounts to billions of bees. And at about the same time, all over the world, other reports began coming in of bees discovering that their hives were virtually completely abandoned. Mm. And so, you know, this is something that just grabbed my attention and really stuck to me, and I couldn't leave it alone. And so I began researching it and looking into it and learning, and of course discovered a lot of symbolism and connection between bees and humans. Bees show up in mythology in various ways and are linked to the goddess, of course, and the creative power. They pollinate literally about 1 in every 3 bites of food that go into our mouths, and so they're profoundly important to us in our own survival. But the key thing about colony collapse disorder is that the bees are apparently just not coming back home to the hive. And as fewer and fewer bees return to the hive with those critical stores of pollen and nectar, then the additional bees need to be sent out to go get those kinds of stores, and eventually none of the bees come back, and the hive itself collapses. And the parallel that I made at the time was that humans in many ways are very much like this, in the sense that we are connected to something that is bigger than ourselves. You know, a hive is much larger than just the sum of thousands of honeybees that live within it. The hive is literally the survival of the bees. It is the community. And by us humans not recognizing or not being willing or able to come back to that something that is larger than ourselves, that sustains us, it actually becomes a problem, because as the hive begins to fail, or the community begins to fail, then it's this spiraling, this downward spiral where one thing leads to another, and both collapse. The hive collapses and the individuals collapse, and because the individuals collapse, the hive collapses. And so this is something that I think in our culture there's room for a tremendous awareness to understand that there is a real need for us to go back to that something larger. Again, whatever you want to call it. I often find that using the word sacred is a good word to use, but some people call it God. Carl Jung called it the self with a capital S. It's that larger sort of blueprint of understanding that is bigger than just our ego selves. And it's something that feeds us and nurtures us and allows us to be aware and conscious of our interconnectivity with all things in the web of life. And as long as we are not focusing on that, are not coming back home to that on a daily basis, we become very lost and separate. And of course, our culture has developed all kinds of ways for us to deal with that sort of sense of separation and isolation that we feel on an individual level. But that was really the core connection that I made between colony collapse disorder and then what I am now calling culture collapse disorder. It's this real risk that, that life as we know it could change dramatically and is changing dramatically. I don't even venture to say that's a good or a bad thing, and some things definitely need to change, of course. But we definitely need to have a more soulful approach to what it is that we're doing here on this planet, both individually and culturally.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So how are we as humans contributing, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, to this paradigm of culture collapse disorder that we're seeing?
Well, it's kind of one of those situations where we're all implicated. None of us is able to step outside of what's happening in the culture and really say that we're not contributing to it. Obviously, for those of us anybody who's listening to this probably has some inkling of a sense of responsibility in what's happening here, and this longing probably to come to greater consciousness around not only what's happening, but what we can be doing. But, it's interesting because even in my research, I really began to realize just how difficult it is to separate ourselves out from this. Most of us drive cars. If we don't drive cars, we probably have to take a bus. There's all kinds of things that are implicated to the greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from our lifestyle from fossil fuels. But not only that, anybody who's wearing silver or gold is contributing directly to mining in probably sometimes third world countries and under not good conditions, but also where the earth is severely disrupted. And the more that we do those kinds of things, I was reading recently that in order to make get just enough gold for one wedding ring, now something like 10 tons of earth has to be displaced to get that. And that's becoming more and more and more true because we have mined all the easy to access kind of gold. And so, the more that we want it, the more we have to dig for it. And so, all that to say, I don't know that there's a simple answer in how we can not be implicated, but certainly there is a profound way that we can begin to look at our situation and understand what it is that we're doing, and be able to go inside and start finding the context and the meaning by which we are living our lives. There's a really interesting book called Constructing America, Constructing the Self by a psychologist named Philip Cushman. And in it, he talks about this concept of the empty self. And this is a really wonderfully descriptive idea of something that I think all of us have felt on one level or another, but which is quite prevalent in our culture. And that is this sense of meaninglessness. The sense that there's something inside us that wants to be filled or filled up, and we don't quite know how to go about doing that. And so we are constantly searching for ways to fill up that sort of emptiness inside of ourselves. And of course, the ways that we've developed to do that are have led to things like addiction, whether it's addiction to drugs or addiction to media. There's all kinds of ways to sort of try to stuff that emptiness that's inside of us. Consumerism is a huge one. If things get rough, go shopping, right? And I'm not saying I haven't been guilty of that, but it's just it's creating an awareness of around what it is that we're doing, instead of being willing to be with the sense of loss that has occurred to us collectively over time. Our ancestors, they lived in more of a communion with nature. And again, it's not to say that they were not warlike, not violent, didn't do things that were destructive to the earth, because of course they did. Humans are not above that in any sense. But there was more of a sense of communion. You know, when hunters went out to kill an animal, they talked to the animal. They didn't just shoot it. They didn't just kill it. And people left things left sacred objects or things at the base of trees, because the trees were enlivened. They had spirits. They were alive. Everything in the world was animate, and therefore there was this sort of infinite web of life in which, you know, each thing was related to each other thing, and that was a constantly dynamic relationship. And we've lost that to such a great extent in our culture. And so part of the problem is that we don't realize what it is that we've lost. And so as we go through our lives being busy, that's certainly an addiction, and using all of these sort of tools to mitigate the difficulty in the circumstances, we really have to find ways in our lives to reanimate the world around us, to stop objectifying things and begin to treat things around us as Thomas Berry, who considered himself a geologian, which is kind of a combination of geologian and theologian. He's an amazing writer. So if anybody hears this and have not read his work, I highly recommend it. Amazing man who died a few years ago. But he talks about it as a communion of subjects, which is this idea that everything is alive and acting and deserves respect and can be dialogued with and can be engaged with on some level.
Wonderful. Yeah, and this topic is so relevant to the summit, because we have many speakers who reference these same kind of things, and needing to get back to this connection with nature, because we are a part of nature, and that's that's how we evolved. That's how we were created. So how does Jungian or depth psychology relate to culture collapse disorder?
Well, this is, for me, I suppose, depth psychology. I mean, I'm such a fan, I guess you can say. That doesn't begin to really talk about it. But for me, depth psychology is a field that really provides some tremendous context and understanding. I mean, talk about finding ways to really be more conscious of that kind of empty self and the ways that I am personally attempting to deal with that. And I will mention too, another thing that is really profoundly difficult for many of us in our culture is that we do have an unconscious understanding or feel that something is very wrong with the way that things have evolved in our culture and the way that we do things on a daily basis, and yet we can't quite put our finger on it. And so a lot of us are carrying this sort of almost disenfranchised grief or trauma around what's happening without really being able to articulate it or really having a container in which we can talk about it. And so depth psychology for me does that on a very deep level. It allows us, first of all, to understand that there are unconscious forces that are at work. And even Carl Jung, who's considered one of the pioneers of depth psychology, I mean, there were many of those early psychologists who can really own sort of that title as a pioneer of depth psychology, including Freud. The two men, Jung and Freud, had a long relationship and then broke, and they kind of went their separate ways. But one thing that was important to Jung was he identified this idea of a collective unconscious. So Freud talked about a personal unconscious, which is a level beyond which we don't really understand what things that we've repressed or things that have not come into our own consciousness that are affecting our own lives. And of course, Jung's idea of a collective unconscious is that there's a whole other layer in which there are these forces at work, patterns that he called archetypes, which are driving us in many different ways, and they show up in our lives in various forms and as various images, but we don't always know that they're working on us. And so just coming to some awareness that there is some archetype that's alive and working on us in our life can be very valuable. For example, if you feel like you're a victim all the time, it's possible that there's the victim archetype, which is at work in your life. And so beginning to understand that, you can then start taking steps to actually change the way that you feel about being a victim all the time. So that's just one example, but Jung talked about the idea of being possessed by these archetypes. And of course, that's kind of a strong word, and maybe not one that everybody can relate to, but the idea of being possessed is really the idea that we are just driven by these forces that we don't understand and or sometimes don't even know that they exist. And so, an individual can't be defined wholly by their own consciousness because there's so much unconscious content that we can never know, or that we should know and maybe at least can begin to dig into. And so depth psychology for me, it provides not only that awareness of the unconscious and those unconscious forces that are driving us, it also provides that container in which we can start looking at those. And it also provides tools, for example, symbols that come from our dreams or that are based in mythology and these stories that have been around from the beginning of time that our ancestors were so profoundly using to create that context and understanding of the order of the world and where they fit in that cosmos of their own world. These things are all available to us if we'll just slow down and take the time to be reflective and begin to look at exactly what it is that's happening here. It can really provide us a glimpse into that ground of reality that's very different than our egoic sort of controlled daily activities that so many of us identify with.
And how does the concept of soul loss tie in with
yes. Well, soul loss is, for me, this is almost it's a beautiful term. And it's describing something that is just not only profoundly difficult, but also poignant on a very deep level. Soul loss is something that indigenous peoples and earth-based peoples often talked about, and it's the idea that people have one or sometimes many souls for a very